Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'm glad you're here with me today, because we're going to talk about a really difficult topic that has affected me deeply, and that I think is very important to talk about. Today we're going to talk about a case that has shaken America and that has become a symbol of the worst possible neglect. Her name is Lacey Ellen Fletcher, and her story is so drastic that I want to warn you in advance. Today's video will contain some very disturbing details. Lacey was a 36-year-old woman from Louisiana who died on January 3, 2022. But the manner of her death and the circumstances that led up to it are something we can hardly imagine. For Lacey spent the last 12 years of her life trapped on a sofa in her own home, where she was found dead, literally fused to the furniture. This case forces us to ask some very uncomfortable questions. How is it possible that someone can live in such conditions? Where was the protection system? And what actually happened to parental love and care? If you're new to my channel, I like to focus on true crime cases that make us think about the society we live in, and the case of Lacey Fletcher is unfortunately one of the most tragic cases I've ever covered. So brace yourselves for some tough minutes, and let's go through this shocking history together. When we look at Lacey's life before the unending tragedy that awaited her, I have to say it was a story that started out pretty normal. In fact, I'd say Lacey's early years were surprisingly active and socially rich, which makes this whole case even more heartbreaking. Lacey was diagnosed with autism during her school years, specifically around the age of 14, which is a relatively late age for this diagnosis. What is both fascinating and tragic, however, is that she lived a relatively normal childhood life up until this point. Imagine, Lacey was a child who had friends, went to sleepovers, even went on trips to Disneyland. She wasn't speechless. She wasn't immobile. She was a little girl who participated on sports teams at school and was active in social activities. The diagnosis came at a time when Lacey began to exhibit what experts call learning differences. Around her 14th birthday, she began to show signs of what was later identified as autism. It was around the time she entered high school that the first serious problems began to emerge. Lacey began to experience increased stress, and her social and cognitive functioning began to deteriorate. It's important to remember that autism can manifest itself in many different ways, and sometimes symptoms can intensify during puberty or during life changes. For Lacey, this happened right during the transition to high school, which is a stressful time in itself for many children. Her parents later described how their daughter began to change. From being a social and active girl, she gradually became withdrawn and had difficulty adapting to her new environment. Unfortunately, instead of receiving the adequate support and professional care she needed, she became the target of something much worse: bullying. In high school, Lacey began to face brutal bullying from her classmates. We can only imagine how difficult this must have been for a girl who was already struggling with her newly diagnosed autism and all the changes it brought. When the bullying became unbearable, Lacey's parents, Sheila and Clay Fletcher, decided to withdraw their daughter from the school system and begin educating her at home. On the surface, this may seem like a reasonable and protective decision by loving parents, who wouldn't want to protect their child from bullying and provide a safe learning environment. Sheila and Clay Fletcher lived in a small town in Louisiana and seemed to have good intentions. Homeschooling in itself is not uncommon. Thousands of American families choose this path for a variety of reasons. It could be because of religious beliefs, dissatisfaction with the public school system, or just because of a child's special needs. In Lacey's case, it was meant to be a solution to her bullying issues and to help her better manage her autism in a controlled environment. The parents probably hoped that they could better tailor education at home to her specific needs, and that they could avoid the stresses associated with the school environment. But as it later turned out, the Fletchers were not prepared for the rigors of caring for a child with autism. According to some sources, the parents felt overwhelmed and frustrated by the unexpected demands that caring for a disabled child placed on them. They may have imagined that homeschooling would be a simpler solution, but the reality was likely much more complex. Homeschooling requires not only teaching skills, but in the case of a child with autism, a deep understanding of the condition, patience, and often professional support. It is unclear whether the Fletchers sought professional help, or had access to therapists or special educators to help with Lacey's education and development. And here begins the most tragic part of Lacey's story before the disaster itself. What began as a protective measure, withdrawal from school due to bullying, gradually turned into something much darker. Lacey became increasingly isolated not only from her school environment but from the outside world. The isolation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process that probably seemed natural or even necessary to her parents. They may have thought that Lacey simply needed peace, that the outside world was too stressful for her, that she was safe at home. But gradually, the protection became a prison. Lacey stopped leaving the house. At first, maybe rarely, then not at all. She stopped socializing with her peers, stopped having any social contact outside the family. Her world narrowed to the four walls of the family home, and eventually to just one room, the living room. It is tragic to imagine how a social girl who had friends and participated in activities gradually became someone who lost contact with the outside world altogether. Her parents probably had no malicious intent, but their decisions and practices led to Lacey becoming increasingly dependent on their care and less able to function independently. Perhaps they thought they were protecting her from a world that was hurting her through bullying. Maybe they believed she would be happier and safer at home. But the reality was that Lacey gradually lost all the skills needed for a normal life and became completely dependent on her parents. This isolation had a devastating impact on her mental and physical health. Without stimulation from the outside world, without social contact, without the opportunity to develop her skills, Lacey's condition only deteriorated. And unfortunately, instead of her parents seeking professional help or changing their approach, the isolation only deepened. When I say that Lacey hasn't left her living room in years, I'm talking about something that is hard for the average person to imagine. Imagine if your whole world was confined to one room. No way to see the sun, no way to get out for fresh air, no way to change the environment. For Lacey, the living room became not only her home, but literally her world. According to the investigation, Lacey spent the last 12 years of her life in that one room. 12 years. That means that from the age of 24 until her death at the age of 36, she saw nothing but the four walls of the living room. When I think of it, it's absolutely incomprehensible. 12 years without a walk, without seeing a doctor, without any contact with the outside world. Her parents later claimed that Lacey resisted any attempts to leave the sofa. They said the sofa was her refuge and that she didn't want to go anywhere by herself. But here we have to ask the question, how is it possible for an adult to be so isolated without any outside intervention? Where were the social services? Where were the doctors? Where were the checks? What is even more frightening is the fact that during those 12 years, no one, absolutely no one from the outside world, saw Lacey. No neighbors, no relatives, no officials. It's as if she's disappeared from the world while living just yards away from her family's normal life. When rescuers found Lacey, she weighed only 96 pounds, which is approximately 43 kilograms. For a woman approximately 167 inches tall, that is an extremely low weight. To give you an idea, that's the weight that a child of about 12 should be, not a woman of 36. This weight is indicative of chronic malnutrition that has lasted for years. According to medical reports, Lacey suffered from acute starvation and chronic protein malnutrition. Her body was literally consuming itself. Muscles were breaking down, bones were brittle, organs were failing due to lack of nutrients. Forensic examination revealed that remnants of material from the sofa and feces were found in her stomach, suggesting that in her desperation she may have eaten whatever was within reach. That's something so horrifying I find it hard to talk about. Imagine the desperation, the hunger so strong that one reaches for whatever is around them. According to investigators, very little food was found around Lacey, virtually nothing except hard candy. How is it possible that the parents left their daughter literally starving? How is it possible that they didn't feed her adequately for so long? By all medical evidence, her death was caused by a combination of starvation and complications related to prolonged immobility. Now comes the hardest part, the part that I have the hardest time talking about. The sanitary conditions in which Lacey lived, or rather survived, were something beyond all human imagination. When rescuers entered the room, they found Lacey covered in feces, both fresh and dried, on her face, chest, abdomen, and all of her extremities. Her hair was extremely dirty, glued together and tangled to the point that it was practically one solid mass on top of her head. But that wasn't the worst part. Her hair was full of maggots and fly larvae that had taken up residence there due to the incredible filth. Imagine the smell, the horror that even experienced rescuers must have experienced. The skin on her head was severely inflamed from the insect bites in constant contact with the dirt. According to medical reports, she had extensive bed sores all over her body, wounds that are caused when a person lies in one place for too long without changing position. These wounds were deep, infected, and some penetrated to the bone. The couch around her was covered with layers of feces, urine, decomposed food scraps, and all sorts of debris. The air in the room was practically unbreathable, according to the rescuer's testimony. Mold and bacteria had grown to such an extent that the entire room was a biohazard. And here comes perhaps the most shocking part of the whole case. Lacey wasn't just on the couch, she was literally fused to it. Her skin, after years of immobility and in those horrible hygienic conditions, had begun to merge with the material of the sofa. Imagine the horror of this discovery. According to the forensic examination, her skin, fat and muscle tissues had blended with the skin and padding of the sofa to such an extent that it was impossible to tell where her body ended and the furniture began. This isn't just a metaphor. It's literally a medical fact. Her body became part of the sofa. This condition suggests that Lacey had been essentially immobile for several years. She couldn't sit up, she couldn't turn around, she couldn't change positions. She was trapped in her own body on a piece of furniture that had become her grave during her lifetime. Medical reports indicate that she suffered from locked-in syndrome, a rare neurological disorder that causes almost complete paralysis but leaves a person conscious. This means she was probably able to perceive everything going on around her, but could not move or speak. Imagine the horror, to be trapped in your own body, aware of your situation, but unable to do anything about it. Remnants of material from the sofa and feces were found under her fingernails, suggesting that she may have been trying to scratch or somehow free herself. Or maybe she was just desperate for anything edible. It's a picture so tragic and horrifying that it's hard to contemplate. On January 3rd, 2022, on a cold winter day in Louisiana, a phone call took place that changed the lives of everyone involved forever. It was the morning Sheila Fletcher picked up the phone and dialed 911. Her voice, according to available records, was calm, perhaps suspiciously so for someone who had just discovered the death of her daughter. "My daughter has stopped breathing," she told the dispatcher. Such a sentence would normally induce panic, despair, crying. But judging by the call log, Sheila seemed surprisingly controlled. The dispatcher on the other end of the line immediately began standard protocol, asking about Lacey's age, whether she was conscious, whether she had a pulse. Clay Fletcher, Lacey's father, was also present during this call. According to records, both parents took turns talking to the operator, who instructed them on how to perform CPR. Imagine the scene. The dispatcher on the other end of the line desperately instructing the parents on how to save their daughter while they know it's already too late. What's so disturbing about this call is the timing. According to a later investigation, Lacey was already dead 1 to 2 days before the parents called 911. Why did they wait? Why didn't they call immediately? These questions remain unsatisfactorily unanswered to this day. The dispatcher continued with cardiopulmonary resuscitation instructions. "Lay her on her back on a firm surface," he instructed. "But how can you put someone on their back when they are literally fused to the sofa?" "Bow her head, lift her chin," the operator continued. "But how can you manipulate the head of someone whose body is in such a state of decomposition?" The parents, according to the records, said they tried to follow instructions, but their answers were vague, unspecific. "We're trying," they repeated. "We're doing the best we can." But the reality was that they weren't resuscitating a living person. They were dealing with a body that had been dead for hours or even days. When rescuers arrived at the Fletcher's home in the small Louisiana town of Slaughter, they had no idea what awaited them. They were seasoned professionals who had seen many tragedies in their careers, but nothing prepared them for what they discovered in the living room. As soon as they entered the room, they were hit by a smell that one of them later described as the worst he had ever smelled in his career. It wasn't just the smell of death, it was the smell of decay, excrement, urine, mold, and something that transcended all boundaries of human experience. In the corner of the room on a leather sofa, they found what was left of Lacey Fletcher. The body was in an advanced stage of decomposition, confirming the suspicion that the death was not recent. The skin was the greenish color typical of decomposition, and some parts of the body were already badly damaged by the decomposition process. But what shocked the rescuers most was the context of the finding. Scattered around the sofa were food scraps, empty wrappers, pieces of garbage. It appeared as if someone had been eating near the decomposing body, as if life in the household had continued normally while Lacey was dying and then decomposing on the sofa. On the floor around the sofa were spilled fluids, a combination of bodily fluids, decomposed food scraps, and other debris. One of the rescuers later testified that the floor was so slippery from all the fluids that we had to hold on to the walls to keep from falling. The walls of the room were covered with stains, from feces, from splashed liquids, from mold that had grown in the damp and contaminated atmosphere. It was obvious that this room hadn't been cleaned in months, maybe years. When investigators and the coroner arrived on the scene, their response was unprecedented. These people, who are professionally prepared to confront the worst scenes of human tragedy, were utterly shaken by what they saw. Coroner Dr. Ewell Bickham III, who has worked in the field for decades, later stated that this was the worst case of neglect he had ever encountered. "I've seen many tragic deaths in my 40-year career, but this one crossed the line," he told reporters. Several investigators had to leave the scene because of nausea. One of the detectives later admitted that he could not sleep or eat for several days after visiting the site. "Images of the room haunted my dreams," he testified. "I've never seen anything so horrifying." A crime scene photographer documenting the crime scene had to stop his work several times. He was visibly shaken and had to go outside to breathe several times, according to testimony from colleagues. "I've been doing this job for 20 years, he said later. "I've photographed murders, suicides, accidents. But this was not human." Paramedics who arrived on the call later required psychological help. Several reported symptoms of post-traumatic stress. One said, "When I close my eyes at night, I see the scene. I can smell the smell. It's something that can't be erased from my memory." The local sheriff also expressed his shock. "I've seen a lot of horrible things in my 30 years on the force, but this is something that changes a person forever," he said at a press conference. "This is not just a tragedy. This is a crime against humanity." Even the experienced forensic experts who came to process the crime scene were forced to work in special protective suits and with respirators. The biological danger was so high that the room had to be professionally decontaminated afterwards. The reaction of the first responders was so strong that the local authorities had to provide psychological support for all the professionals involved. This was the first time in the history of the county that massive psychological support had to be provided for a single case. Coroner Dr. Ewell Bickham III, who conducted the autopsy on Lacey Fletcher, had to make a decision that had huge legal implications. After thoroughly examining all available evidence and performing a full autopsy, he came to a conclusion that shook the entire system. Lacey's death was classified as murder by neglect, or homicide by neglect. This decision was not made lightly. Dr. Bickham, who has decades of experience in the field of forensic medicine, had to carefully consider all aspects of the case. Classification of a death as murder requires clear evidence that the death was caused by the act or omission of another person with the intent to cause death or grievous bodily harm. In Lacey's case, the evidence was overwhelming. The coroner had to prove that the parents knew of their daughter's condition and that their inaction directly led to her death. She had to document that there were options available to help Lacey, but that those options were not pursued. A classification as homicide by neglect means that the death was not accidental, not caused by disease or natural causes, but was the direct result of neglect. Dr. Bickham also had to consider the psychological aspects of the case. He had to assess whether the parents had the mental capacity to understand the gravity of the situation and whether they had the means to provide adequate care. His conclusion was unequivocal. The parents had both the knowledge and the means to prevent Lacey's death, but failed to do so. This decision opened the way for the prosecution of the parents. Without classifying the death as a homicide, it would have been impossible to bring murder charges. The coroner's verdict thus became a key point in the entire legal process. The forensic doctors who carried out the autopsy on Lacey Fletcher were faced with a case that went beyond any of their previous experience. Their report contained details so gruesome that some parts were removed from public documents because of their graphic nature. Lead forensic physician Dr. Dana Troxclair described the condition of Lacey's body as incompatible with life. The skin on her buttocks and back was worn or eaten away after years of immobility, according to the report. Large yellow areas indicated a complete loss of skin, while other areas were blackened and unrecognizable. The bone structure was severely damaged. Forensic analysis revealed advanced osteoporosis. The bones were so fragile that they had fractured with normal handling during autopsy. This condition occurs with prolonged immobility, when bones lose density due to lack of physical activity. The muscle tissue was in an advanced stage of atrophy. The muscles in her limbs had virtually disintegrated, indicating that Lacey had been unable to move for a very long time. Forensic doctors estimated that the complete loss of muscle function must have taken at least 5 to 7 years. Internal organs showed signs of chronic failure. The liver was shrunken and fibrotic, the kidneys showed signs of chronic damage, and the heart was weakened and smaller than normal. All of these findings were consistent with prolonged starvation and lack of care. Neurological examination confirmed the diagnosis of locked-in syndrome. Brain tissue showed changes typical of this rare condition, in which the patient remains conscious but loses the ability to move and communicate. This finding was key to understanding Lacey's situation. She was likely able to perceive her situation, but could do nothing. The investigation revealed a shocking fact. Lacey had not seen a doctor since she was 16 years old, meaning over 20 years without any medical care. This finding was crucial to understanding the extent of the neglect. Detectives went through all available medical records at area hospitals and doctors' offices. No doctor, no nurse, no medical professional had any contact with Lacey after her 16th birthday. That means her locked-in syndrome was never officially diagnosed or treated. The absence of medical care was particularly tragic given that locked-in syndrome requires intensive and continuous medical care. Patients with this diagnosis need regular rehabilitation therapies, nutritional support, skin care, pressure ulcer prevention, and many other interventions. Lacey received none of these. Investigators also examined the nutritional aspects of the case. Analysis of stomach and intestinal contents revealed minimal food. Other than a few hard candies, no remnants of a normal diet were found. This finding confirmed that Lacey was suffering from chronic starvation. Nutrition experts who consulted on the case calculated that Lacey was getting a maximum of 200 to 300 calories a day, less than a quarter of the recommended daily intake for an adult woman. Such caloric intake is incompatible with long-term survival. Chemical analysis of hair and nails revealed a chronic deficiency of essential nutrients. Protein, vitamin, and mineral levels were extremely low, suggesting malnutrition lasting years. These findings were consistent with a picture of chronic starvation. The forensic team also analyzed the medications found in the home. No medications prescribed for Lacey were found, no antibiotics for infections, no analgesics for pain, no skin care medications. This was further evidence of a complete lack of medical care. The social worker who was brought in to investigate confirmed that the Fletcher family had not been in contact with any social services. There were no records of visits, of requests for help, of any attempts to seek support for the care of her disabled daughter. This isolation from the social support system was another key part of the tragedy. The legal process in the Lacey Fletcher case began in May of 2022, when the East Baton Rouge County Prosecutor's Office formally filed charges against Sheila and Clay Fletcher. The decision to charge both parents with murder in the second degree was made after months of careful investigation and consultation with legal experts. A charge of murder in the second degree in Louisiana is a very serious crime that can be punishable by life in prison without the possibility of parole. This category of charge is used in cases where the death was caused by intentional conduct, but without premeditated intent to kill. In the context of neglect, this means that the prosecutor had to prove that the parents willfully ignored their daughter's medical needs, knowing that their inaction could lead to her death. Prosecutor Sam D'Aquila, who led the prosecution, had to carefully consider legal strategy. A charge of murder in the second degree requires proof of specific intent, that the defendants acted with knowledge that their actions were likely to result in death or serious bodily injury. This is more difficult in a neglect case than in a direct assault case because it must be shown that the failure to act was intentional and knowing. The legal team also had to consider precedents for similar cases in Louisiana and other states. Extreme neglect cases are relatively rare, and charging parents with murder for neglecting an adult child presented a legal challenge. They had to prove that the parents had a legal duty to provide care and that the breach of that duty was so serious that it met the definition of murder. The prosecution also had to address the issue of the defendant's mental state. The defense likely argued that the parents suffered from their own mental health problems or that they did not know how serious Lacey's situation was. The prosecutor had to prepare evidence to rebut these arguments. The legal process was not straightforward. The original charge of murder in the second degree was initially dismissed by a judge who doubted the strength of the evidence to prove intent to kill. This decision was a major disappointment to prosecutors and to the public, who had been demanding justice for Lacey. However, the prosecution did not back down. The case was presented to a grand jury, which in June 2023 decided to reinstate the murder charge in the second degree. The grand jury, composed of citizens of the county, heard testimony and reviewed the evidence, and decided that there were sufficient grounds to reinstate the prosecution. During this process, there were intense legal discussions about the appropriateness of the charges. The defense argued that the parents were unable to provide adequate care due to their own limitations, and that their actions did not meet the legal definition of murder. They argued that it was a tragic incapacity rather than a deliberate crime. The prosecution gradually found that proving intent to kill would be very difficult. Although the evidence of neglect was compelling, proving that the parents actually intended to kill Lacey, or that they knowingly acted with the intent to cause her death, presented a legal challenge. They therefore decided to consider the possibility of a plea bargain. A plea bargain. Negotiations about plea bargaining went on for several months. The defense argued that their clients were also victims, that they were overburdened with caring for their disabled daughter and did not have the resources or knowledge to help her. The prosecution, on the other hand, insisted that the level of neglect was so extreme that it could not have been accidental or unintentional. In the end, a compromise was reached. In February 2024, the parents decided to accept a plea bargain and plead guilty to a lesser charge of manslaughter. This charge still constitutes a serious crime, but does not require proof of intent to kill and carries a lesser penalty than murder in the second degree. A no contest, nolo contendere plea is a specific type of plea that has significant legal consequences. Unlike a guilty plea, a no contest plea means that the defendant does not deny the charge, but neither does he or she explicitly admit guilt. This plea has the same criminal consequences as a guilty plea, but cannot be used against the defendant in any civil action. Sheila and Clay Fletcher chose this strategy presumably to protect themselves from possible future civil suits from other family members or other parties. The no contest plea allowed them to avoid the risk of life in prison that was imminent on the murder charge, while minimizing their legal liability in other proceedings. The process of accepting a plea bargain required a judge's approval. The judge had to carefully review the terms of the plea bargain and ensure that the defendants fully understood the consequences of their decision. He also had to consider whether the proposed sentence was appropriate to the seriousness of the crime. The March 2024 hearing was an emotionally charged event. Judge Samuel C. D'Aquila, not the same as the prosecutor, presided over the sentencing ceremony. The parents appeared in court in orange prison uniforms, handcuffed. Their attorneys made statements of mitigating circumstances, while the prosecution argued for a harsh sentence. The The sentence of 20 years imprisonment with an additional 20 years suspended was a compromise between various legal factors. An active sentence of 20 years means that both parents will spend at least 20 years in prison, likely more given Louisiana's parole rules. An additional 20 years of parole means they will be under close supervision by a probation officer upon release. This sentence reflects the seriousness of the crime, but also the age of the defendants and the absence of their prior felony convictions. In handing down the sentence, the judge emphasized that although the parents may not have intended to kill their daughter, their level of neglect was so extreme as to merit a severe sentence. He also noted that no punishment could bring Lacey back to life or remedy the suffering she had experienced. When Lacey Fletcher's case hit the media, it sparked an unprecedented wave of interest and discussion on social media. I have to say that I was amazed at how quickly information about this case spread across all platforms, from Facebook to Twitter to TikTok to Reddit. It was something I hadn't seen to this extent in similar cases. Thousands of posts with the hashtag #JusticeForLacey appeared on Twitter, shared by people from all over the world. The discussions were incredibly emotional, people expressing shock, anger, despair. Many wrote that they couldn't sleep after reading the details of the case, while others admitted that it had changed them forever. One woman wrote, "I have 2 children with disabilities, and this is my worst nightmare. How is it possible that this happened?" Facebook groups dedicated to true crime cases exploded with discussion. Administrators of some groups even had to implement special rules for discussing Lacey's case because the comments were so intense and sometimes aggressive. People called for harsher punishments, while others called for reforms to the social services system. Entire threads devoted to analyzing the case have sprung up on Reddit. Users who claimed to be social workers, doctors, or lawyers shared their perspectives and explained how the system could have failed so badly. One comment, which had thousands of upvotes, said, "As a social worker, I know the system has gaps, but this isn't a gap. This is a chasm." TikTok influencers began creating videos about the case, some with millions of views. Young people who may never have heard of locked-in syndrome were suddenly learning about the condition and discussing the rights of people with disabilities. It was fascinating to see how the educational content mixed with emotional reactions. YouTube channels focused on true crime began devoting entire episodes to Lacey's case. The comments under these videos often included personal stories of people caring for disabled relatives, or stories of people living with disabilities themselves. One comment that particularly struck me was written by a man caring for his wife with multiple sclerosis. "Every day I worry that I can't handle caring for my wife. But when I see what happened to Lacey, I realize that giving up is not an option." Lacey's case revealed a systemic failure that shocked experts and the public. Social workers across America began to openly criticize the flaws in the system for protecting vulnerable adults. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a professor of social work at Tulane University, wrote in a scholarly article, "The case of Lacey Fletcher reveals fundamental problems in how we understand and implement the protection of vulnerable adults." The criticism focused on several key areas. First and foremost, the absence of regular home education checks. It found that Louisiana has very loose regulations for home education, and that there is virtually no oversight of what happens to children who are educated at home. Experts pointed out that while public schools are required to report suspected neglect, homeschooling circumvents this safety net. The National Association of Social Workers issued a statement calling Lacey's case a systemic failure of catastrophic proportions. The organization criticized the lack of resources for adult protective services and the underfunding of programs to support families with disabled members. Disability rights experts pointed to problematic isolation. Dr. Ari Ne'eman of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network explained, "Lacey's case shows what can happen when a person with a disability is completely isolated from the community. With no outside contacts, no friends, no neighbors to ask questions, the worst forms of abuse can occur." Lawyers specializing in disability rights criticized the lack of legal mechanisms to protect adults with intellectual disabilities. Unlike children for whom there are relatively robust systems of protection, adults with disabilities often drop out of the care system once they turn 18. The public reaction to Lacey's case was not just emotional, it was also actionable. Within weeks of the case being publicized, dozens of petitions were created on platforms such as Change.org and Care2, demanding legislative changes. The most successful petition, titled Lacey's Law: Mandatory Controls for Home Education and Disability Care, garnered over 150,000 signatures in its first 3 months. The petition called for mandatory annual visits by social workers to all families who home educate a child with a diagnosed disability. Another petition focused on reforming adult protective services. It called for a doubling of funding for these services and the creation of a national registry of vulnerable adults. This petition gained the support of several celebrities, including actress Temple Grandin, who herself lives with autism. Local initiatives have also emerged. In Louisiana, a group of parents of children with disabilities have formed an organization called Voices for Vulnerable Adults to lobby for legislative changes at the state level. Their first campaign focused on creating mandatory wellness checks for all adults with severe disabilities. Disability Rights Louisiana, a disability rights advocacy organization, used Lacey's case as a catalyst for broader reform efforts. They have filed a lawsuit against the state of Louisiana, arguing that the state has failed in its duty to protect vulnerable citizens. At the federal level, several congressmen have announced plans to introduce legislation inspired by Lacey's case. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts has introduced a bill called the Lacey-Fletcher Act that would provide federal funding to expand adult protective services. Organizations like the National Disability Rights Network used the case to mobilize their members. Their Never Again campaign focused on raising awareness about the signs of neglect and abuse of disabled adults. They created educational materials that were distributed to thousands of community centers across the country. Lacey's case also inspired the creation of new nonprofit organizations. The Lacey-Fletcher Foundation was founded by a group of Louisiana activists to provide support to families caring for adults with severe disabilities. Their first grant program provided financial support to families to purchase medical devices and respite care services. Dear viewers, after all we have been through together in this video, I feel it is our collective responsibility to talk about what we can do to prevent similar tragedies. Lacey's story is not just another true crime case. It's a warning that makes us all think about how closely we watch the world around us. I want you to know that the signs of neglect are not always obvious. It's not like in the movies where the neglected child looks dirty and skinny. Neglect can be silent, hidden behind the walls of the home, disguised as protection or privacy. Often it starts innocently. A parent says their child doesn't like to go out, that they are shy, that they like quiet at home. But attention should be paid when someone in your neighborhood disappears from social life altogether, when you don't see your neighbor's daughter or son for months, years, when questions about their health are answered evasively or nervously, when parents seem unusually withdrawn about their adult children. Also, notice unusual smells from houses, unkept gardens, store-bought packages at the door. It may sound like curiosity, but sometimes a healthy curiosity is what can save a life. If you suspect someone in your area may be in danger, don't be afraid to contact your local social services or police. I also want to appeal to the health professionals among you. If you are a doctor, a nurse, a therapist, be alert to families who suddenly stop coming for checkups. Ask why a patient with a chronic illness is not coming for regular appointments. Don't give up easily when parents tell you that everything is fine. For teachers and social workers, pay attention to what happens to children who are suddenly withdrawn from school for homeschooling. This is not a problem in itself, but it can be the start of dangerous isolation. Ask if there are plans for continued social contact, for participation in community activities. It is important to me that you know that help exists and that no one has to face caring for a disabled family member alone. In the Czech Republic, we have some great organizations that provide support to families and to people with disabilities themselves. The Society for the Support of People with Intellectual Disabilities in the Czech Republic has a helpline at 7706262202. Their counselors are available for consultation on rights, services, and practical advice for day-to-day care. You can also find them at Poradne SPMPCR.cz or on their website www.spmpcr.cc. The National Council on Disability operates a counseling service on 2302-34956 or 2302-34957. Their email is poradnan@nrzp.gz and their website is www.nrzp.cz. This organization specializes in legal advice and advocacy for disabled people. You can contact the Association of the Disabled in the Czech Republic at 7258-22050 or email marie.vondraskova@svstp.cz. Their website is www.cstp.c, and they provide a wide range of services from rehabilitation to social support. Charity Czech Republic has a nationwide network of services for people with disabilities. Their main number is 2962-4330, and their website is www.charita.cz, where you can find contacts for local branches across the country. If you need immediate help or suspect abuse or neglect, please do not hesitate to contact the helpline on 116, which operates 24 hours a day and is free of charge. I want to stress that seeking help is not failure. It is an act of strength and love for the person you care for. No parent should face the challenges of caring for a severely disabled family member alone, without the support of professionals and the community. Dear viewers, if you are as affected by Lacey's story as I am, if you feel it is important to talk about and educate yourself on these difficult topics, please support this channel by subscribing. Your support allows me to do in-depth research on similar cases and bring you quality content that makes a difference. Please share this video with your friends and family, not because it is easy content to watch, but precisely because it is not. Lacey's story is something that should be known, something that should change the way we look at how we protect the most vulnerable members of our society. I am very interested in your views and experiences. Let me know in the comments what you think about this case. Do you have experience caring for a disabled family member? Have you ever encountered similar situations in your area? Your stories and perspectives enrich the discussion and help build a community of people who care about these issues. If you are a professional, social worker, doctor, lawyer, psychologist, please share your professional insights. Your comments help other viewers better understand the complexity of these situations and how to prevent them. I would also be grateful for your suggestions for other cases I should address. I look for stories that not only shock, but also educate and inspire change. Cases that show both the dark side of human nature and the possibilities for correction and prevention. Don't forget to turn on your doorbell to be notified of new videos. We plan to continue this series on neglect and abuse of vulnerable people because I believe education and awareness are the keys to preventing tragedies like this. Finally, I want to say that Lacey Fletcher deserves to have her story not forgotten. She deserves for her suffering to have meaning, to lead to changes that will protect other vulnerable people from a similar fate. Each of us can be that person who notices the signals, who speaks up, who helps. Be that person. We can't help Lacey anymore, but we can help others. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the next video.